On Tuesday, November 15th, 2016, at 11:40 p.m., at the intersection of Shields Road and Scotland Street in Glasgow, a black Audi RS4 pulled up to a red light. Behind the wheel was a 26-year-old father of two. Just moments later, a second vehicle pulled up right beside him. The events that followed would launch one of Scotland's most intensive homicide investigations in recent memory, where a single, careless error would ultimately seal the killer's fate. But this story really begins years earlier, 20 miles away in a town called Paisley, where a bitter, long-standing feud over power and respect had already left a trail of violence, court battles, and death. A conflict that started as a simple turf war on local streets would escalate into one of Scotland's most brutal rivalries, connecting two violent events separated by years, yet bound by the same dark undercurrent flowing through the nation's criminal underworld. This is the story of the Paisley drug war and the targeted hit in Glasgow that it spawned, and how both incidents pulled back the curtain on the true scale of organized crime in Scotland. Welcome to Echoed Crimes. Let's dive right into the case. Back in the mid-1990s, the Fergusley Park neighborhood in Paisley had already earned a reputation with law enforcement as one of Scotland's most challenging housing projects. Years of economic hardship had made the area a breeding ground for small-time muscle, who soon evolved into sophisticated criminal networks. At the heart of this conflict were two rival factions. One was headed by Stewart "Specky" Boyd, and the other was controlled by the Rennie family. Their beef started as a simple territorial dispute over street corners and collecting local debts, but it quickly escalated into an all-out power struggle to control the region's narcotics trade. Boyd's crew operated with a degree of organization that was unusual to see outside of Glasgow back then. His inner circle included Stewart Gillespie, George Docherty, and Robert Pickett, names that would eventually become very familiar in courtrooms and police press briefings. They conducted their business discreetly, using legitimate-looking front companies and raw intimidation to maintain their grip. Meanwhile, across town, the Rennie brothers were making a name for themselves. Mark, Barry, and their crew controlled different supply lines running through Paisley, and they had no intention of being pushed aside. In the fall of 1995, the simmering rivalry finally boiled over into violence one November night. The Rennie brothers were ambushed right outside their home. A shotgun blast was fired at point-blank range in what prosecutors would later call a clear assassination attempt. The brothers miraculously survived, but the attack was a major turning point. Investigators quickly connected the incident to Boyd's crew, but they found that few local residents were willing to talk. This wall of silence wasn't out of fear of the police. It was terror of the retaliation that would surely follow. Soon, the violence spilled out beyond the streets. To expand his influence, Boyd had established a company called FCB Security, a private firm that secured city contracts to patrol housing developments and construction sites. On the surface, the business appeared completely legitimate, but police and local officials started to suspect it was just a front used to launder money and feed information back to Boyd's criminal enterprise. When the company finally went under, it owed the city council over £300,000. By early 1996, the situation in Fergusley Park had become completely unsustainable. Witnesses were being threatened, testimony was being recanted, and even jurors were being intimidated. This led Scottish authorities to create a dedicated witness protection program for the very first time, a decision directly prompted by the escalating violence between Boyd's gang and the Rennie family. It was a clear signal of just how dire the situation had become. A single, small neighborhood had forced the entire justice system to fundamentally change its procedures. The stage was set, and the next act of violence would push the conflict past the point of no return. On the evening of May 23, 1996, the feud that had held Paisley in its grip finally reached a deadly breaking point. A 26-year-old Mark Rennie was riding his bike down Stock Street, just near his home, when a car suddenly pulled up from behind. Witnesses reported hearing two distinct, sharp cracks before watching him collapse to the pavement. He'd been shot twice in the back at close range. The assailants didn't stick around to confirm the outcome. The car just sped off, leaving Rennie bleeding out on the street. This brazen murder was the bloody culmination of months of escalating tension between the Rennie brothers and Stewart "Specky" Boyd's crew. It was just 6 months after the very same shotgun ambush outside their home that Mark and his brothers, Barry and Brian, had narrowly survived. In the months following Mark Rennie's murder, investigators zeroed in on the man they believed was the mastermind behind the violence: Stewart "Specky" Boyd. His name kept surfacing in connection with the Rennie attacks, the weapons involved, and the entire network that fueled Paisley's cocaine and heroin trade. But by the time authorities were ready to press charges, Boyd was gone. He had fled Scotland, disappearing into Europe under a fake identity, and for several years, he remained beyond the reach of the law. When he was finally brought back, he stood trial for conspiracy to commit murder, accused of orchestrating the feud that had left one man dead and others scarred for life. The case captured national headlines. An alleged crime boss brought back to face justice for a wave of violence so intense it forced law enforcement to completely rethink its strategy against organized crime. And yet, when the verdict was read, the outcome stunned the law enforcement community. After weeks of evidence, the jury found Boyd not guilty. The prosecution's case had hinged on witnesses who later admitted they were intimidated or simply refused to take the stand at all. The justice system had buckled under the exact same climate of fear Boyd's organization was built on. With the charges behind him, Boyd quietly began expanding his empire. He was spotted in Spain, traveling between the Costa del Sol and Glasgow, where a new generation of drug dealers now saw him as their primary supplier. According to court documents from subsequent cases, he was involved in money laundering and protection rackets connected to a network of Scottish criminals living abroad. Back home, his top lieutenants, Robert Pickett and George Dosharty, continued to run the operation on his home turf. They were both eventually convicted for the 1995 shotgun assault on the Rennie brothers, a story we've already detailed, and received substantial prison sentences. Their incarceration created a power vacuum that Boyd quickly filled by forging new alliances outside of Scotland, and soon, firearms started flowing north from England. This was all part of an expanding criminal enterprise that was blurring the lines between petty local squabbles and major national trafficking operations. But we'll circle back to that in just a moment. By the turn of the millennium, the Paisley feud had evolved into something far bigger than a simple turf war. It had become a full-blown criminal ecosystem, one that stretched from the housing projects of Scotland to the sunny coasts of Spain, and from parking lots in Paisley to train stations on the English border. Boyd's acquittal didn't end the story. It just allowed it to morph into something new. The same men who once battled over a few city blocks now controlled a major cross-border trade. It was a trade that would soon attract new players, more sophisticated weapons, and another wave of bloodshed by the early 2000s. Investigators tracking the fallout from the Paisley feud started noticing a disturbing trend. The shootings hadn't stopped, but the weapons themselves had changed. The locally sourced sawed-off shotguns and converted handguns that once fueled gang rivalries were disappearing. They were being replaced by military-grade firearms, often with their serial numbers filed off and parts imported from overseas. What had begun as a local neighborhood dispute had now evolved into a professional organization with direct access to European suppliers. The most stunning example of this surfaced in 2012. That's when an undercover investigation exposed a plot to smuggle a cache of weapons north to Scotland. The shipment included an Uzi submachine gun and several high-capacity pistols. It also contained hundreds of rounds of ammunition. The connection back to Paisley and Glasgow's organized crime circles was undeniable. The network behind the shipment included individuals who had long been on law enforcement's radar for their ties to key figures from the Boyd and Gillespie era. The big break in the case came when Dempsey ditched 2 camouflage bags at Carlisle Station. The cleaning staff alerted the transport police, who opened the bags and discovered the arsenal. The trail quickly led them to Barry Kelly and Craig Colquhoun, both from Paisley, and to an active-duty British soldier named William Dempsey. Stationed in England, Dempsey had exploited his access to military-grade weapons and his contacts to acquire parts and ammunition for the crime syndicate. Another man, James Ashdown, would later plead guilty to related offences at Liverpool Crown Court in 2013. The entire conspiracy was exposed. Kelly and Colquhoun were found guilty of conspiracy to transfer illegal weapons, while Dempsey confessed to his role in the arms pipeline. The court was told how the group planned to move the firearms north, to be sold or used by various Scottish crime syndicates. Investigators testified that several of these networks could be traced right back to individuals with ties to Stewart Boyd's original organization. The whole operation laid bare the new reality of Scotland's criminal underworld. The weapons on the street were no longer homemade or crudely modified. They were now being imported, catalogued, and distributed with the cold efficiency of a corporate supply chain. It also revealed how former street-level enforcers from the 1990s had transitioned into logistical roles, handling the movement of weapons and coordinating communications across international lines. For Police Scotland and the National Crime Agency, the seizure in Carlisle served as a stark warning. While the open warfare in Fergusley Park had subsided, the underlying infrastructure it created was very much alive, operating in the shadows and connecting enforcers, couriers, and former gang members in a sprawling network that reached from military barracks to inner-city back alleys. It was a system destined to eventually find its way back to Paisley. By October of 2012, the old Paisley feud was no longer front-page news, but the architects behind it were still major players in Scotland's criminal underworld. One of these men was Stewart Gillespie. After serving the majority of his life sentence, Gillespie had been released on parole, living a quiet life in an apartment in Gallow Hill, Paisley. Officially, he was out of the game, but old grudges and outstanding debts have a tendency to outlive the people who carry them. In the early morning hours of October 25, 2012, police were dispatched to a disturbance at a top-floor apartment on Glenburn Road. Once inside, they discovered Gillespie suffering from multiple stab wounds. Despite the efforts of paramedics, he was pronounced dead at the scene. The man responsible, Norman Carlton, was apprehended nearby following a brief search. Detectives would later testify in court that the attack was both ferocious and premeditated, a brutal knife assault that persisted even after Gillespie had collapsed, a detail shared at the High Court in Glasgow. Prosecutors painted a picture of Carlton as a man with his own violent past, noting he had previously served time for culpable homicide in an unrelated killing from 2001. This time, he was facing a murder charge. The trial brought to light that the confrontation inside the apartment had escalated rapidly, though the exact motive remained murky, whether a personal dispute, a drug debt, or a lingering tie to Paisley's criminal network. The verdict was, regardless, decisive. Carlton was convicted of murder and the attempted murder of another man, Robert Lauder, who was also present during the assault. The judge handed down a minimum sentence of 22 years. For those who remembered the 1990s, Gillespie's death was more than just another statistic. It symbolized the end of an era for the old Fergusley Park generation. George "Goofy" Doherty had already been taken out in a gang hit years before. He was stabbed on the street and then run over multiple times by the same vehicle in a savage act of retaliation, which was believed to be connected to Glasgow's long-running war between the Daniel and Lyons crime families. I'll be covering that entire rivalry in a separate and more detailed video, since there's a ton of material to unpack. According to reports citing prison and police informants, James Jasper McCann, an associate of the Daniel faction, was at one point a person of interest in Doherty's killing. However, despite an extensive investigation, no one was ever convicted for the murder. The case officially remains a cold case. Meanwhile, Robert "Piggy" Pickett was serving a lengthy prison sentence for his role in the earlier feud. He was shot and critically wounded in a 2006 gang hit that also took the life of 21-year-old Michael Lyons. During the ongoing war between the Lyons and Daniel crime families, Pickett later became directly entangled in a series of murder-for-hire plots between 2016 and 2017, targeting his rivals, including Stephen Bonzo Daniel, a high-ranking member of the Daniel faction. In May of 2018, he was sentenced to 16 years in prison, along with 5 of his associates for those crimes. Even while incarcerated, Pickett continued to wield his influence. Reports coming out of HMP Kilmarnock described him as essentially running the prison alongside his son-in-law, Christopher Kavanagh, who served as his muscle on the inside. Kavanagh, age 30, later admitted to stabbing Robert Forbes in Paisley back in 2017, an attack that prosecutors alleged was ordered after Forbes went to the police with information on Pickett. Kavanagh took the fall as part of a plea deal that resulted in the charges against Pickett being dropped. By the time of these later convictions, Pickett had become tightly allied with the Lyons gang, signaling a major shift from his original Paisley allegiances. In Glasgow's broader criminal landscape, his reputation behind bars was built on control and intimidation. A man whose authority was forged over decades of navigating Scotland's most treacherous criminal networks. Meanwhile, Stewart Boyd, the figure who once held sway over Paisley, had met his end in a 2003 car crash on Spain's Costa del Sol, a collision that claimed 6 lives. The old guard had fallen, but the toxic culture they built remained in Paisley, on the very streets where the Boyd and Rennie crews had once battled for control. These streets were still haunted by their legacy. A new generation of crews, inspired by the notorious legends of the 1990s, stepped in to fill the power vacuum, operating in smaller, more clandestine cells that were much harder to track. Local units of Police Scotland relentlessly conducted operations targeting illicit substances and firearms. But the scars on the community ran deep. Fergusley Park, once the epicenter of a brutal turf war, stood as a stark case study of how a few years of unchecked violence could leave a permanent mark on a town for decades. The hit on Stewart Gillespie closed a chapter, not with a sense of peace, but one of sheer exhaustion. The key players were off the board, but the criminal machinery they had constructed kept grinding on, setting the stage for a new generation of organized crime destined to extend its reach far beyond Paisley. The feud itself may have ended, but its echoes continued to reverberate. By 2016, that same violent undercurrent had shifted its focus to Glasgow and claimed its next victim on November 15, 2016. The scene was Glasgow's Kinning Park district, a quiet industrial strip connecting the south side to the river. At 11:40 at night, a light rain began to fall. At the intersection of Shields Road and Scotland Street, a black Audi RS4 pulled up to a red light. Behind the wheel was Euan E.J. Johnston, who, according to police, was a reputed figure in the city's organized crime network. On the surface, it seemed like an ordinary end to a typical night out. Johnston had just finished a late dinner at the Red Pepper, a small Italian spot on St. Andrew's Road, where he dined with a friend, 31-year-old Brian McMahon. Surveillance footage from the restaurant shows the pair entering at 10:46 at night, appearing relaxed and in no hurry. Johnston was known within Glasgow's criminal circles as part of a small but busy crew that operated between Pollokshields and Maryhill, moving product and cash for bigger players up the food chain. But what Johnston didn't know was that even as he ordered his meal, another vehicle, a dark Audi Q5, was already casing the area. That same car would be spotted just minutes later on several different security cameras. At 11:30 at night, it was seen making 2 slow passes by the restaurant before turning onto McCulloch Street, a small side street that offered a clear line of sight to the Red Pepper's front window and Johnston's parked car. The occupants of the Q5 were clearly conducting surveillance, patiently tracking his movements, timing his routine, and preparing for what was about to happen. 2 individuals then got out of the vehicle, strolling past Johnston's Audi RS4 and then circling back. One was spotted wearing a dark, Nike high-tech windrunner jacket, notable for its distinct reflective zipper, an item that would later become a crucial piece of evidence in the investigation. When Johnston and McMahon finally left the restaurant around 11:38 at night, they got into the RS4. At that moment, surveillance cameras captured the Q5 moving in perfect sync, its headlights falling in line right behind Johnston's vehicle, as both cars made the turn onto Shields Road. At 11:40 at night, Johnston's journey came to a halt at the red light on Scotland Street. He was on the phone with his partner, Danielle Carruthers, assuring her he would be home soon. In the next instant, 3 gunshots shattered the quiet night, and a night that started with dinner would end in a cold-blooded execution. 2 rounds hit Johnston directly in the head, with one passing straight through his skull and brain, inflicting what forensic examiners would later classify as a completely unsurvivable injury. The third bullet lodged itself in the rubber seal of the driver's side door, just inches from McMahon. The shooter's aim was precise, professional, and absolutely lethal. The force of the first shot sent Johnston slumping sideways, his foot reflexively slamming down hard on the accelerator. The RS4 rocketed forward at full throttle before veering wildly across the intersection. It jumped the curb and slammed into roadside barriers, its frame crumpling against a metal guardrail near the entrance of the Shields Road subway station. McMahon, dazed but physically unharmed, frantically tried to help his friend, but Johnston was completely unresponsive, slumped over the steering wheel, blood soaking into the upholstery. At 11:41 p.m., the 911 call came in. Witnesses reported a car speeding north toward the Kingston Bridge, its headlights switched off as it vanished into the night. Police and paramedics were on the scene within minutes. Johnston was extracted from the mangled car and rushed to Queen Elizabeth University Hospital. Despite desperate attempts to revive him, doctors could only confirm what was grimly apparent at the scene. He had sustained a catastrophic brain injury. At 2 a.m. on November 16, 2016, Euan Johnston was pronounced dead. In the hours immediately following the hit, Glasgow's roadways were locked down in every direction. Officers from the Major Investigations team began pulling surveillance footage from every intersection between Kinning Park and the city's north side. By sunrise, detectives had zeroed in on a pattern connected to an Audi Q5, all thanks to the video evidence. Just after dawn, the search yielded a breakthrough discovery. In Paisley, several miles north of the murder scene, firefighters were dispatched to a burning Audi Q5, abandoned on a vacant lot. By the time officers got there, the vehicle was completely engulfed in flames. It had been deliberately torched. The next phase was slow, methodical, and purely forensic. Whatever the fire hadn't destroyed was sifted, catalogued, and examined by experts from the Scottish Police Authorities Forensic Service. Inside the blackened frame, investigators found 2 pieces of evidence that would ultimately crack the case wide open. The first was a spent shell casing, with a caliber and markings identical to those recovered from Shields Road. This ballistic match tied the torched vehicle directly to the shooting. The second find was much smaller, fragments of a Nike high-tech zip-up jacket, which had partially melted and fused into the debris on the passenger side. The charred fabric was sent out for analysis. Forensic scientist Morag Coyle later testified in the High Court that she examined the zipper area and managed to recover a viable DNA sample. The result came back as a direct match to David Scott, age 33, of Glasgow. It was the first solid link between the gunman and the crime, seen a critical mistake the killers hadn't planned for. Investigators then cross-referenced the forensic evidence with the surveillance footage, establishing a precise timeline of events. Following the trail of the Q5's activity, piece by piece, the case was coming together, forming an unbreakable chain of evidence, strong enough to put a name to the triggerman, and soon a face, as detectives finally closed in on David Scott. The takedown operation was planned with the same meticulous care that had defined the entire investigation. Officers from Police Scotland's Major Investigation team coordinated a pre-dawn raid on an apartment in Glasgow's East End. Armed tactical units surrounded the property, sealing off all escape routes. He was arrested on suspicion of murder, read his rights, and taken into custody for questioning. That same day, forensic teams began meticulously searching the property, recovering clothing and electronic devices for further analysis. Detectives later confirmed that several items were a match to patterns observed on the surveillance footage. When the case finally reached the High Court in Glasgow, it carried all the weight of a gangland-style execution, and the prosecution had the evidence to back it up. At the center of the trial stood David Scott, 33, from Glasgow, charged with the murder of Euan A.J. Johnston on November 15, 2016. Alongside him in the defendant's box was Anthony Ruthven, also 33, who was alleged to have conspired with other unknown individuals in the attack. Both men pleaded not guilty to the charges. The prosecution, led by Advocate Depute Alex Prentice KC, described it as a well-planned hit. The prosecution then laid out all the overwhelming evidence. At the time of his murder, Johnston himself had been awaiting trial at the High Court on charges of trafficking £640,000 worth of heroin, a case that tied him to organized criminal syndicates operating between Glasgow and Paisley. Prosecutors argued that his death was directly connected to those same underworld disputes. The jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict against David Scott. But the story doesn't end with the verdict. Even after his conviction, David Scott continued to be a violent and volatile presence within Scotland's prison system. By December of 2019, while serving his life sentence, Scott was already making headlines again. Inside HMP Perth, he launched a savage assault on Paul Lyons, a member of the notorious Lyons crime family, the very same network we covered in our first case. The assault went down in the prison's visitation room, right in front of families and staff. Surveillance footage captured Scott dashing across the area, yanking a homemade shank from his waistband and viciously slashing Lyons repeatedly around his head and neck. Lyons was left with a gash perilously close to his carotid artery and required emergency medical intervention. This attack was no isolated outburst. Just weeks earlier, Scott had executed another violent assault inside HMP Edinburgh, targeting inmate Dale Thomas with a brutal 1-2 punch, a knife attack, and a concoction of boiling water and sugar. A vicious, napalm-style assault designed to scar and blind. Thomas lost a piece of his ear and sustained severe burns. Prosecutors later revealed what drove Scott to commit both attacks. He was convinced that Lyons and Thomas were holding a grudge against him for his part in Johnston's murder. His defense team framed the assaults as preemptive strikes, claiming Scott was acting out of fear that he himself would be targeted. In total, he pleaded guilty to 3 charges of serious assault, one of which was against a prison officer during a later confrontation. In October of 2025, Police Scotland announced a renewed search connected to the case, this time located a good distance from Glasgow. Acting on fresh intelligence, specialized officers began excavating a grassy embankment near an open area off Soroba Road, roughly 90 miles northwest of the city. Detectives suspected that a firearm tied to Johnston's murder could be buried there, hidden away after the attack. The operation pulled in forensic teams, divers, and national resources, all combing the site for several days. This came after years of unresolved leads and the long-held suspicion that more than one individual was present during the shooting. Police once again appealed to the public for information, stressing that allegiances may have shifted over the 9 years that had passed since the attack. Potential witnesses were strongly encouraged to come forward, with assurances that their anonymity would be protected. This renewed search was more than just a hunt for evidence. It was a powerful statement that even nearly a decade later, the Scottish justice system had not forgotten. Johnston's murder had exposed the brutal efficiency of the city's criminal underworld, and Scott's conviction had brought a degree of closure, but as long as others who played a part remained unidentified, The investigation was still very much open and unfinished. When the verdict was announced in May of 2018, Lady Stacy handed down a life sentence, ordering that 33-year-old David Scott serve a minimum of 22 years before becoming eligible for parole. The man accused alongside him, Anthony Ruthven, was formally cleared of all charges after the prosecution withdrew its case mid-trial. The Crown conceded that there was no forensic evidence, CCTV footage, or witness testimony connecting him to the shooting. Ruthven walked free, leaving the same question that had haunted investigators from the very beginning. Who were the other, unknown individuals mentioned in the indictment? For Scott's vicious assaults on Dale Thomas and Paul Lyons, plus the attack on a prison officer in 2020, he was given an additional 8-year sentence in 2021. This means he will likely spend the vast majority of his life in custody. What do you think about this case and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts down in the comments. We'd love to hear your take on it. And if you found this deep dive informative, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and hit that notification bell so you never miss the next episode of Echoed Crimes.